Okay, so we've got this really interesting question that came in from one of our listeners, and it's about protest coverage on TV. And I think it's really something that we need to really look into because it gets at something that I think is really important.
Yeah, for sure.
So the question specifically references this Reddit thread. It's on Rask Reddit. And the title of the thread is "Why Aren't the Mass Protests That Have Been Happening Across America Receiving More Airtime on TV?"
Okay, interesting question.
Right. And so this is what we're going to be diving into today and try to figure out, what's the deal here? What are some of the perspectives that are offered? And, what are some of the reasons that people are giving for this apparent lack of coverage?
Definitely. And I think, right off the bat, what's so interesting is that even just the way the question is phrased and how people start talking about it, you see some really deep ideas. Like, for example, right away in that thread, you've got people bringing up Gil Scott Heron, the revolution will not be televised. And even Kendrick Lamar, kind of tapping into this concept that like real change might be happening outside of the mainstream media spotlight.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's like the idea that if you're waiting for it to show up on your TV screen, you might be missing the real movement.
Exactly. And I mean, one person even talked about how like the first time they heard Gil Scott Heron, it like totally changed their thinking about media and social movements. Oh, wow. So it really makes you stop and think about like where we get our information from and how that shapes what we see is important.
Yeah, and how our perspectives are formed for sure. Okay, so the question itself is built on this premise of mass protests, right? But then like right away people start debating like, are these protests actually massive enough to deserve that kind of national attention?
Right. And that's a huge part of the discussion because a lot of people are saying, look, these protests, they just don't compare to what you see in other parts of the world. Like someone brought up Serbia, for example, where, you might need like 100,000 people to even be considered a major protest in terms of media coverage.
Wow, so
It makes you think like, what's the benchmark here? What actually qualifies as a mass protest for national news?
right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting because you have this other side, this counter argument that says, look, impact and strategy, those can be just as important, if not more important, than sheer numbers. They brought up the example of the airport protests back in 2017 against the travel ban, the Muslim ban, as they called it. And those protests, they weren't, millions of people, but they caused a lot of disruption and they got a ton of attention.
Exactly. It's about like strategic targeting, hitting those pressure points.
Right. And then they also brought up the Iraq war protests in New York City, where you had hundreds of thousands of people marching. But did that actually lead to the outcome that the protesters wanted?
Right. It really raises that question of like, is it just about bodies in the street or is there something more to it? Yeah.
It seems like it's more nuanced than that, definitely. And speaking of nuances, there was this really interesting perspective from someone who said they were involved in the 5501 movement.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
And they described these ongoing protests that are happening like all across the US, like in every single state at the same time. And they're like, why is nobody covering?
This is a good question.
Right. And what I thought was really interesting is that they point to specific actions by the Trump administration. Like they talk about an FBI task force that was related to Tesla, and then also like arrests of students who were legal residents. And they're saying, look, this is proof that these protests are actually being noticed by people in power, even if they're not on TV.
So then the question becomes, if they're having an impact, why are we seeing more coverage?
Yeah, exactly. And this leads us to like a big elephant in the room, right? Yeah, the whole issue of media ownership and how financial interests might be playing a role.
Right, because a lot of people are saying, look, mainstream media is owned by wealthy individuals and corporations, right? And it's in their best interest to not really highlight protests that might challenge the existing power structure.
Yeah, they even use the term class war against billionaires,
Yeah, and they see the media as basically being the mouthpiece for the billionaires.
which, I mean, I guess you can kind of see how that perspective arises, right? Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, ownership is so concentrated in the hands of just a few companies.
And they even list some of them in the thread.
Yeah, like National Amusements, Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, News Corp, Sony.
Right. And the argument argument is that, those big players, they have a huge influence on what stories are considered important and how they get presented to the
Public for sure. And I think this is where that idea of agenda setting comes into play because if you've got these powerful entities that might be threatened by certain movements, they might not be so keen on giving them a lot of attention.
right. And then there's also the business side of it, right? Like at the end of the day, media is a business, exactly, and advertising is a huge part of how they make money.
Phew.
So it makes sense that they might try to avoid content that's seen as too controversial or that could alienate a big chunk of their audience.
Right, because you don't want to scare away your advertisers, right? And then on top of that, you have to think about audience preferences too. Like maybe people just aren't as interested in watching protests on TV. Maybe they prefer more entertainment or lighter news.
Yeah. And so it's like this combination of corporate interest and market demands that's kind of shaping what we see.
Yeah, for sure. It's this complex interplay.
Okay, so we've talked about the ownership side of things, but the Reddit thread also gets into how the protests themselves might be a factor in the lack of coverage.
Yeah, and some people are pretty blunt about it. They're like, look, protests are just boring to watch. Really? Yeah. They're saying news tends to focus on dramatic visuals, like property destruction or clashes with the police. Oh, okay. And if a protest is peaceful and orderly, it might not be seen as newsworthy visually.
I mean, I can see that from like a visual storytelling perspective, right? It's like if you're a news producer, you're looking for something that's going to capture people's attention.
Exactly. You need something that's going to grab them visually.
Right. And then some people were even saying that just complaining online doesn't really count as protesting. Oh, interesting. And that maybe you need to be more disruptive if you want to get the media's attention.
Like you have to make it impossible to ignore.
Right. And then another point that they brought you is whether these protest movements have like a clear, unified message and strong leadership.
Right, because if you don't have that, it could be harder for the media to frame it.
Right. And to explain it to a larger audience, yeah, it's
Exactly. Like, what is the story here? Who are the key players? What are they trying to achieve?
and the thread talks about how there are all these different focuses like government actions, wealth inequality. And it's like if you don't have that one clear message, it can get lost in the noise.
Right, it becomes harder to package it neatly for a broad audience.
Okay, so we've looked at the ownership side, the nature of the protests themselves, and now I want to touch on some of the logistical and cultural factors that were brought up. Yeah, for sure, especially when you compare the US to other countries.
Geographically, the US is massive.
Right, it's huge. And so if you want to have a big national protest, you're talking about people traveling really long distances.
Right, which isn't easy or cheap.
Exactly, and especially when you compare it to a country like Serbia or France where things are more geographically concentrated.
Right, it's a lot easier to get people together in a smaller area.
And then there's also the financial aspect of it.
Yeah, a lot of people were talking about how they just can't afford to take time off work to travel to a protest. Yeah.
Right, and the fear of losing your job for being politically active is a real concern for a lot of people.
Definitely, especially in the US where job security isn't as strong as in some other countries.
And that leads into this idea of protest culture and how it might be different in the US compared to somewhere like France.
Right, because in France they have a longer history of mass mobilization.
Yeah, and maybe a greater acceptance of more disruptive forms of protest as a way of making your voice heard.
Right, and the presence of strong labor unions in some European countries also makes a big difference in terms of organizing and mobilizing people.
Yeah, and then there's the whole issue of police response.
Right, because in the US, there's a lot of concern about police brutality and the militarization of police forces.
And a feeling that police can use force against protesters without facing any real consequences.
Right, and that can make people hesitant to participate in protests,
Yeah, and it also might make media outlets more cautious about covering protests.
especially if it involves showing potentially controversial footage of police actions.
Right, and the threat even brings up the historical example of the Bonus March,
Oh, wow, yeah, during the Great Depression.
where protesting veterans were met with like really brutal force from the government.
It's a dark reminder of how protests can be suppressed.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so now I want to be fair and acknowledge that not everyone in the thread agreed with the idea that there are all these underreported mass protests happening.
Right, there were some people who were like, hold on. Are we sure these are actually mass protests?
Yeah, they were sharing their own experiences of going to protests that were supposed to be big.
And nobody showed up.
Right. And so they're questioning whether this whole thing is being blown out of proportion.
Right. And they're saying, look, if these protests were really huge and disruptive, the media will be all over it, right?
Because they'd want those viewership numbers.
Exactly. It's all about eyeballs
And then there's this other idea that maybe people are just apathetic.
or just too distracted.
Right, like they're more interested in entertainment than in political action.
And that could explain both the lower participation in protests and the lack of interest from the media.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that not all media outlets are ignoring protests.
Right. Some people in the thread pointed out that public television, NPR, the Associated Press,
International news organization like The Guardian and the BBC.
yeah, they're all covering certain protests and rallies.
So it's not like there's a complete blackout.
Right. It's more about which protests are seen as newsworthy and how much coverage they get.
So as we wrap up this dive into this really interesting Reddit discussion, I think it's clear that there's no easy answer to the question of why some people feel like mass protests aren't getting more attention on TV.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue with a lot of different factors at play.
We've looked at the scale and nature of the protests themselves, the influence of media ownership and business models, the logistical challenges of organizing in a country as big as the US, and even the cultural context around protests.
That is all interconnected. It's like this web of influences.
And so as we leave you with this, I think it's worth asking yourself, what do you think is the most significant factor that's limiting the coverage of protests? Yeah. And if you wanted to bring more attention to these movements, how would you go about doing that?
What would be the most effective strategy?
Right. And maybe even think about that idea that was brought up at the beginning. The revolution will not be televised, right? Is it actually happening outside of the mainstream media?
And if so, what does that mean for how we understand social change in the 21st century?
Definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.